Today. All right. It is another day at the office for Arron Johanson and I. Here we are on Monday morning talking about the things that are important in the legislative session. But, first of all, I think, it's kind of interesting in Hawaii, wouldn't you think, Arron, as we have this, you talk about a true melting pot, right? And what how many of us are wishing we were Irish today, and how many, I was saluting my Japanese friends Ohara and Ohata this morning, and you just heard Charlie O'Garrett. But isn't that sort of a reminder of, hey, look we're really all kind of the same. Let's work together, kind of.
Yeah, no, definitely, and that's one of the things that makes us special. I mean, you look at me and I look like every other Hapa kid.
Yeah, chop suey.
But I'm Irish too. So
and
no one would ever know it.
Yeah, and by the way, and that's sort of unique because there was a time in history where Scandinavians and Irish, they didn't get along too well either, and I guess we've seen a whole big thing. And I've got some really great facts around the place, but I think today is the day where everybody wants, if not green beer, good cheer, and they want corned beef and cabbage and vegetables, and that's kind of like Hawaiian food.
Yeah.
Pipikala, right? Anyway, what sort of things are happening on a day like today when everybody is celebrating or wish they can be celebrating? We have some really sobering things I'd like to talk about today, and that is the importance of some of the bills that are now being hashed through your committees and others, and what significant pieces of legislation there still are around where people really ought to be giving their representatives and their senators some input.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think the most significant thing at this juncture, and you could see it on everybody's face, is the state of the economy. The Council on Revenue's projections, their decline. They went from marginal growth in our economy to forecasting 0% growth in the economy, and that immediately makes us take a dive in what we expect in the outlying years. So we passed a budget out of the House last week, and that means the Senate is considering it this week, and then we'll conference on it and ultimately get it together. But basically, what the House did, the House reduced the governor's request by about $180 million, and that continues the general House's trend of reducing the governor's asks. Last year we did it by about $600 million.
I remember that. Now, isn't this a harsh wake-up call? One of the things that you have been constant on, and so is the minority party's budgeting suggestions and things, is that this is sort of a dose of reality because, I don't want to say that we were runaway spending, but we were pretty close to it, and yet we had a balanced budget. How sobering is it when the Council on Revenues comes up and says, hey, you know what, we missed it by that much. We are really going to be short, and talk about how this tumbles backwards and how people got to make, not have to, but it's mandatory. We've got to make some adjustments.
Yeah, I think it lends credibility to the argument of the House's posture, and particularly what we as the Minority Caucus have been advocating for a long time, that you can't count on future hopeful expected revenues to justify spending now, especially if you're not positive that it's going to materialize in our economy that is relatively unstable and not going through a period of robust growth, which is why we always advocate some prudence. And so does the Finance Committee, and so did the House in this case. And I think it was wise because even though we cut $180 million, the Senate's probably going to have to cut off some more just to keep pace with
the new projections. Sure.
Yep.
Well, it's ironic because I've had the opportunity in the last couple of days to talk to a few of the folks that have thrown their hats in the ring in the Democrat Party for the congressional office, and almost every one of them shared with me when I asked this or a similarly framed question, and I'll ask you the same question, is that wouldn't it be nice if the federal government had the same mandate as states in our state and our counties do, having a balanced budget, because we don't have that federally.
Yeah, it definitely would. I think what you would find is that it would mitigate a lot of the problems that are bogging down the national economy and that continue to stymie Congress because nobody's willing to find the political will to actually solve the situation.
Arron, when you come up with the platform that you have come up with, the budget suggestions and everything else, I know that you have some specific for examples. In other words, here's one area where we really could save some money because it's not just yelling into the wind and saying no, no, no. In other words, somebody says no new taxes and then should say why or why not. So that is your banner, if you were, now that I've got to know where you're coming from, is reduced our cost of living.
Right.
And those are wonderful words, but we need to be specific about some ways we can do that.
Well, some of the ways that we can do that, for instance, there are multiple measures moving through both the House and the Senate that would start to apply the general excise tax to online purchases, and most times they currently aren't applied.
By the way, I've seen a shift of absolutely not to, well, that makes some sense. And have you? I mean, I shop online, and I don't want to pay 4.712 here on Oahu more than I am. But if I can let my fingers do the shopping, if I still feel that there are deals there, it's okay. I mean, I understand. I don't want to be a thief.
Yeah.
You know?
And that's the argument that some proponents make. I think on the opposite hand, you have others who do believe that still continues to increase the cost of living. And this is a prime example of, I don't think people would argue that, the tax equity part, but sometimes you do have to think, where does the rubber meet the road? And at the end of the day, if people are shopping online, do they have more money to pay to taxes?
Because and here's an important thing that we all have to realize about shopping online. Basically, people are not shopping for staples and groceries and this afternoon's dinner online. It's more, I want to say, luxury items or consumer goods that aren't being bought generally by the low-income or no-income folks. In other words, most people that are online are not online using their food stamps or their BET card, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think in order to redeem that, you probably have to be doing that in person at the grocery store.
Yeah. And so, but I mean, that being said, wouldn't there be local ways that you could say, well, look, if you really want to have that whiz-banger computer or that motorcycle or that ski boat or that, remote control helicopter for your kids, you're going to pay a little extra. That we call that sort of a VAT or a luxury tax. But we're going to remove the tax from those that could most have that removed for buying food and for paying for medicine.
Well, and that's the argument that others have made. I mean, I think there's some other bills that, for example, this legislative session that either continue to keep the cost of living high for the foreseeable future. For instance, the gas tax is actually supposed to sunset in 2015.
Good luck with that sunsetting.
Right. There's a bill that would extend that sunset date to 2030. Now, imagine the cost of living a reduction you would have if all of a sudden the high prices that you pay at the pump were reduced significantly, because we impose one of the highest gas taxes in the nation. But, it's become a source of money for so many things in state government that nobody wants to see it end.
What I also think is really interesting, and we'll talk about this after the break, some legislation that's up looking at these vapor cigarettes and looking at these other things. Well, I know on the mainland that there's this huge organization of vaping folks that are saying, look, the pressure is coming from tobacco because they don't want people using our stuff, which is healthier. They want the tobacco. And right now, there are some states that are putting as high as a 200% tax on the vaping paraphernalia because they don't want to lose that revenue from tobacco.
Well, yeah, and what's also interesting is many of these industries are very dynamic. So if you talk to some of the tobacco people, some of them are starting to pioneer their own electronic cigarettes. To get their share of the market.
Yeah, because they realize if you can't fight them, join them, right?
Yeah, just like McDonald's did with imitating Starbucks coffee.
There you go.
McCafe was a direct response to Starbucks.
Hey, we got more coming up. No email in this session, please. Okay, Arron Johanson's in the house, and we're talking about things that are important. And the most important document, I think, coming out of the legislature this year, and I know that you have your pet things and everything, we all do, but it's got to be a good, solid, balanced budget. And one thing that Arron was telling me off the air, and I think you should expound on, is that a lot of these bills that are really destined to become, law, you're saying that there's a wee bit of the shaving going on because the council revenues is pretty real.
Right.
And so if somebody really wants something to go through, they might say to somebody that they agreed to add something in on, maybe we better not do that because the core of this bill is more better. Can you give us some ways that works or should be working?
Sure. So right now, after the decreased projections, it makes everybody sweat around the legislature, not just with respect to the budget, but people also know, if their bill's got a price tag to it because it requires an expenditure or some appropriation, to fund it, that it's a whole lot less likely in a year like now where we're starting to see decreased future projections. So you start to get everybody taking a very sobered and realistic, and that's sometimes the good thing about less than ideal projections is it makes everybody a lot more sobered about.
Arron, how does it make you feel when you take a look at from just a numbers situation. I know that you have people in your staff that say, okay, this is what this costs, and this is what. Doesn't it sometimes grind on you when you see a bill that you know is good, but that is going to cost more than we can afford because there are things on it that really, I mean, I guess they have a little something to do with it, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're just there.
Yeah, well, and the good byproduct of the fiscal reality that we're now facing is it makes people a lot more realistic. You know, everybody asks for the moon, shoots for the moon, and times like this make it a lot easier to say that's just not going to happen. What is the realistic price here?
Aaron, what about government departments that towards the end of the year go on this mad dash to spend cash? In other words, they had something, maybe let's say that it's, I'll just pick one, has nothing to do with it. Let's say transportation department. In their budget, they've got $500,000 for road repainting, and they haven't done it. And at the very last minute, they do it. Instead of saying, look, we saved this, give it to us next time, but look, we saved this. That I haven't heard of that. Does that happen, do you think?
It happens more at the federal government than it does at the state government, but it still happens here too. And I think one of the great things that's happening as a result of some of the reform going on, particularly on the House side with respect to the finances and the budget, is we're starting to try to change the way the state does budgeting and the culture of budgeting. So typically people just assume the base. We've started a zero-based budgeting pilot with one of the agencies. But what's more, we tried to say to the departments, look, if you can justify the expense and it's a legitimate one of taxpayer dollars, then you're probably going to get the request. If you can't justify it and it's not legitimate, we're not going to fund it. And it's changed some of the behavior. For instance, people used to use unfilled vacant positions to fund vacation payouts. When people, if Mike Buck leaves the office and Mike Buck has got to be paid out for all of his accrued vacation, instead of filling a position, we'll use some of that position.
Some of that money to pay the guy's vacation.
Right, which
makes your operations look pretty good.
Well, and it's directly sort of flouting legislative intent by funding that position. And this was something we discovered last year, and it was something that obviously is not the most proper thing to do, but it was how so many departments were using those vacancies kind of like a slush fund. And so what's been nice actually is more of the departments, because I think they realize there's some real intent and empathy with trying to understand their requests, have started to be more forthcoming about that kind of
Okay, you know what comes to mind when you say that, and everybody's heard this a little bit, that every now and again, the governor, I remember when Governor Lingle had to do this, and I know the Governor Abercrombie did this a couple of years ago, sends out a directive to their department saying, okay, submit your budget, and then one that's 10% less, one that's 15% less, and one that's 20% less. That's getting real, isn't it, when you do that? Because nice to have, must have, and absolutely must have, and then super essential gives a lot of leeway, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Is it because the departments in the past, if they didn't use it, they would lose it?
They actually, sometimes I think that's the perception, but the legislature unfortunately never looks at the base. They just look at increases or decreases to it. And so, they in some respects, we do budgeting on autopilot, and not, I think, in the best way possible.
Yeah, that's really a good point, because I think what you're saying is, let's say that I'm the governor, new governor, and I'm a department head. I'm now the head of this. I go in there and I'm going to be asked to come up with a budget in a year. So what I do is look at the old and say, okay, well, that makes sense, and then I just do it. Yeah. In other words, you accept what's being handed to you instead of saying, gee, it seems to me like this is all wrong. I don't think we should spend this much money there. Or listen, we've been kidding ourselves. We've been getting away with, we've been surviving on less money than possible. We need more money, and here's why.
Yeah, and usually what happens, particularly for the legislature, because we're only part-time, is sometimes you'll discover something just because it's your niche, your area that you know. But in some states, like Georgia, you actually have to say this is mandated by law, this particular function, this program is in statute, this one is just discretionary, and here's why we're continuing it, here's why we're not, here's why we're asking for the increase, here's what we recommend. And you just get more information in some other states than you do here. And so we're really trying to reform that, particularly at the House level, how we do budgeting. I want you to explain how this caucus is working and how the House effort, the bipartisan effort, is working. But I also think that one of the things that everybody is very
cautious and care about right now is that we have this big debate going on about charter schools and funding. We've got a lot of stuff at the university that needs to be addressed. And also the education, the money that we're spending in education, we want to give us better bang for our buck. And there are a huge number of bills that are leaning on this, the big E word, the big education word.
Yeah. One of the particularly costly expenditures that it's not necessarily in doubt, but it certainly begs the question of how we're going to pay for it, especially now, given these projections, is the governor's early learning initiative.
Mm-hmm.
So, public funding for private preschools, particularly for some of the most needy preschoolers who aren't getting that education. How are we going to pay for it? Because it ranges somewhere, but in the several $100 million.
Yeah, that's. I mean,
basically a new expenditure.
That's a lot of money.
Yeah, it is.
But there's other concerns. I had the opportunity to be at the University Federal Credit Union annual dinner. I was the annual MC of it. And I asked a question there amongst this huge audience, mostly people that were really in touch with the university, what they thought about a 30,000-foot stadium. And I know this came out of the blue the other day. We want to build a stadium. Not where, but we just want to do it. And the reason was given was because the state charges them too much for Aloha Stadium. And isn't there a way for the legislature to get and say, hey, look, it's left hand charging the right hand. Shouldn't some of these things be dealt with?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of inefficiencies in overlapping government services that, unfortunately, until somebody actually calls it out, people aren't aware that it's a problem.
That being said, I do know that there's going to be, and there is, a tremendous amount of consternation at this time of the year, both of the city and the state budgets, over items that get confused, what state, what city in responsibility, and particularly a lot of those in the transportation department.
Yeah. I get a lot of complaints about potholes, and many of them are on the state freeways and highways, but a lot of them are on the city roads.
By the way, many of you are going to be hearing this breaking news. A 4.4 magnitude earthquake hit the Los Angeles area this morning. No tsunami threat once again, but the U.S. Geological Survey reported a 4.4 magnitude quake off L.A. The quake struck about 3:30 a.m. Hawaii time at a depth of 5.3 miles near Westwood, California. Quake was centered near the intersection of Mulholland Drive and 405 freeway. No reports of damages. We're so lucky. I mean, we've been lucky, and I do know that a lot of times it must be tempting, Aaron, that we've got a lot of money at both the county and state levels that we put into tsunami awareness, we put into emergency preparedness. We kind of get amnesia. We forget how bad the last one was.
Yeah.
How protective do we have to be of those monies?
I think we have to be really protective because, if any of these disasters, for instance, ever hit the city and county of Honolulu, I mean, a lot of the hurricanes have sort of passed us by, and unfortunately Kauai has gotten the brunt of it. But, if it were to hit here, the financial hub and some of the other things, we'd be in a really tough way. And these natural disasters are always costly, and there's never a good time to prepare for it. So you always have to assume that level of readiness and preparedness. Yeah,
that's a good point. We've seen that our two super ferries that we're going to get pressed into that sort of use, if the need be, are going to use somewhere else. But what about this? I remember when the former head of Civil Defense, Ed Teixeira, pointed out, time after time after time, that we are more liable to have long-term effects of these phenomenon because other states have states near them that aren't affected. In come the trucks and the bulldozers and the people.
Right.
We don't have that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When you look at Hurricane Katrina, for instance, people were fleeing New Orleans.
Just go somewhere else.
Driving to Texas and a bunch of other places, but that's not an option for us here. So we're stuck, literally.
That being said, I don't know if people really understand how much our legislature gets schooled on what we have in reserves, what the state owns, what sort of emergency equipment we have, and food and medical supplies and things that have got to be constantly re-upped because there's no glamour in that, right?
Yeah, we hear it every now and then in different briefings, and I can tell you it's a shockingly short supply.
Yeah.
If the supply chain were disrupted, the amount of food that we have here is only a few days worth.
Yeah, at best. I mean, and we're talking days. And then people do strange things when they're hungry, and even with families. I mean, I don't want to give a lot of credence to things, but there's this one reality show on that's just horrible. It's called The Doomsday Preppers, where these people go out and prepare for Armageddon.
Yeah.
And they start talking about what attitude their neighbors are going to have when they're hungry and when there's no food. And it knocks down a lot of doors, they say. That's why they build these big ones. Okay, we got plenty more to come. Representative Arron Johanson and I are going to share some of the things that I was asking him about a minute ago when we come back, and that is this bipartisan group, nonpartisan group that I should say, working together at the House level to be pretty equal on treatment of things that can be maybe not quite as political as some other issues. It's the Green Beer Day. Be careful. Don't drink. If you fall in the river, don't drink. And Arron Johanson and I are here, even though it's sort of a light day, and it's almost, for me, it's hard to concentrate on St. Paddy's Day. You're wearing the green. I've got my shamrock tie on. We all sort of think, boy, we need sort of a respite. And kids just being out on that. What we were talking about just before the break was the huge number of dollars that we spend on education. And let's talk about, I want to say, this sort of new direction with this nonpartisan group in the House that is able to get past politics, at least in some of the more important issues.
Mm-hmm. You see that a lot in the Finance Committee, and I have to give credit where credit is due to our chair, Sylvia Luke. She's been the one who is willing to often take on the governor, and most people don't take on the governor when they're from the same party to say, we're going to reduce your budget significantly. It's easy to do. It's easy for the legislature to do that to Linda Lingle because she was from an opposite party, but to say this is not a justified expense, I'm going to cut. And to be as fiscally responsible as I think she's been takes courage and it takes vision on her part. And she's done things that people heretofore have just never been willing to do. Like she cut everybody's vacant positions until they justified why they're vacant,
right?
Yeah.
I love that. But, there's another thing, too, and that is the harsh reality of it all is that we keep kicking the can down the road. Mm-hmm. I think that this body, even though they're not doing as much as they probably could have in this session, they're doing a lot more than some expected, are a group of people, Democrats and Republicans, that are seeing the harsh reality of we just can't keep rolling down this road. It's not working.
Right. And we have to prepare as though winter may come again someday and do so from a budgetary standpoint.
What about the interplay that's going on internationally? We know that a lot of our country's gross national product goes to help people in other countries. And there are a lot of people that say, look, if we are in trillion-dollar deficits, why do we continue to give billions to other countries? At the local level, in your own constituency, do you get that from people sometimes that just say, hey, I hope that you can stop the crazy spending in Washington?
Sometimes people ask that. I mean, people generally know that I'm not in Washington.
It's not my
DC,
department,
so,
not yet, anyway.
But the people who are following politics like to talk about all kinds of things when you're at their door. And I like to follow national politics, too, so I always get a kick out of it when we're talking about those kinds of things. But.
Well, that being said, we're looking at missile defense right now. We're certainly looking at what's going on in Ukraine. I mean, it looks like we just keep drawing another line in the sand. I'm talking about the whole world. But look at all of the people that spout the mantra, borders, language, and culture, how much more money would be available at state levels if the Fed weren't on a runaway spending spree.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's why it's healthy for any administration, any president to take a look at what are really our national priorities. How does this manifest itself in terms of both diplomacy and defense spending? And how is this in relation to the rest of the global actors? And, when for most of my life,
you've been in cold country, right? Cold areas.
Well, I was going to say Vladimir Putin wasn't always the head of Russia.
Yeah.
He has been for quite some time now, but, there were friendlier presidents before him where, post the Cold War, Russia wasn't as big of a threat as it now seems to be on the global
Well,
stage.
I mean, I remember the day I seeing the video when I was a kid and just starting out in the business of Nikita Khrushchev pounding on the table with a shoe. I mean, and this guy just went crazy. Putin is another breed. I mean, what about all of the people? I hate to digress, but because of your Washington and international experience, it's sort of interesting because everybody that thought the USSR was a done deal, they're not. I mean, they're this quote, this vote in Ukraine, whether it's accurate or not in Crimea, has sort of said, look, the people that are there, they want this thing to be recreated. It looks like it.
Well, there's still a lot of, I think what we forget because we're in the West and the Cold War sort of went our way, what we forget is there's so many people in Russia and even in some of the old Soviet satellites who had a great fondness for the USSR, and it literally collapsed overnight because it wasn't a planned transition to democracy, which is why their democracy has been so messy. capitalism has largely been, some of these magnates, some of them of questionable background, controlling the economy, and their democracy doesn't look like it does in the West because it was an immediate transition, and this
like overnight, right?
Yeah. And this is one of the things that China watches. China is very afraid of being the next USSR, which is why they control everything so desperately. But when you look at Russia, there's a lot of people who may not necessarily feel like their life is better now than it was under the old Soviet regime. So there's still some fondness for that, which is
let's look at one thing that we have in this country, Arron, and that is, we've managed to sort of evade the real reality of homelessness in a lot of places, even here. And during the time of the USSR, people weren't homeless. I mean, there was a government, hovel for them to be in somewhere, and they got their borscht, and they got their beets, and they got their vodka when they wanted it. Right. So people weren't starving to death or freezing in the streets like they are in our own country right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of complex problems that we're having to figure out how to deal with in the modern context, even in America.
Okay, now but let's bring this back home for a minute. We see today where we're likely to have a tremendous reduction in military spending. Based on the council, based on the Council of Revenues, that didn't necessarily take into consideration some of those ramifications. What are you looking at? I mean, hundreds of millions, right?
Yeah, I think I was reading in the paper this morning. It's about $200 million. Affecting.
Some places aren't affected by that, but we are.
Yeah,
that's a lot of money.
Yeah, and that's specific to just Hawaii.
Now, that being said, how important is that news going into the committee work that you all have to do during the next couple of weeks to make these numbers work? Because certainly that's going to be something the Council on Revenues can say, wow, on top of that, well, we better look at, maybe that's $200 million, but some of that $200 million is in this revenue plan, and that's gone now, and we didn't know about it.
Right, or that this reduction in $200 million and the spending, the reduction in spending it will have in the local economy will then have some ripple effects. So the House passed out the budget last week, and unfortunately, lots of world events don't always coincide well with our budgeting cycle, which happens in a 60-day period.
Yeah, they don't call us up for permission to do something while we're making the budget.
The budget is now in the Senate. The Senate will be hearing it, and the Senate has made some of its own adjustments along the way. Where this is probably all going to be reconciled is in the conference committee. So, for all of April, figuring out these details, not only just the Council of Revenues reductions, but also what is the reduction in military spending in Hawaii entail, and should we cut it some more? So what I think you're going to see is more successive cuts to the governor's requests and spending, through each iteration of the budget.
By the way, I'm getting some very interesting questions via email. It's like I explained during this session, we don't do that. So those of you that have taken the time in the last 45 minutes to email us, would you turn that into a phone call instead at 296-5467 or 296-KHNR? I think, too, that we have, before the break, I want to make sure that people understand the difference. We already know, almost everybody does know the difference in the city administration between whether it's a county or whether it's Oahu or whatever, Honolulu. It's the mayor and the city council are checks and balance. I mean, that's by the nature of it.
Right.
And I think that people still are confused as, is it them and us in the Senate and the House? What are the two roles of the body? And you've explained that before. And it is, in a way, similar. It is checks and balances. But there are three players, right? There's the administration, the House, and the Senate. So Correct. It's a little bit different than the county.
Yeah, there's one more level of check because there are two bodies in the legislative realm instead of just one. The city council is all one, but the House and the Senate are divided. So there's another check. Okay,
now I have a question, and somebody almost emailed the identical question, but it doesn't matter because I think I would have asked a bit of it anyway, and that is when the harsh reality does set in and that it gets down to crunch time, what do you think are some of the things that may go by the board? I mean, you've had a chance, I know, and everybody probably winks at some of the things. Is there any particular place where it is really noticeable that we need to take something? It needs to happen, but not in its present form because it costs too much.
Yeah, a lot of the tax credits are probably going to go by the wayside. So, when we talked about a bevy of bills that would impact the tourism industry, a tax credit.
You're talking the TAT tax credit?
No, I mean for construction spending, for renovation, for hiring of employees. those kinds of tax credits typically have a big fiscal price tag attached to them, and so unfortunately sometimes they go by the wayside. Again, good, I think, needed things for economic stimulus in the market setting, but sometimes the state will just say, we can't afford this from a revenue perspective.
Okay, we got more coming up, including what's being done at the state level and county level on addressing homelessness as it affects the income flow. If we're going to have fewer tourists here, shouldn't we cocoon them away from the bad experience that sometimes the homeless the homeless population brings into the resort areas? Well, somehow in Boston, along with the green beer and good cheer, they're going to get some beans in there. Shipping it out to Boston. More of that to come as we play all Irish bumper music today. Great day to get out and do it. I do know that the down at the foot of Merchant Street is going to be an interesting evening tonight as everybody that wants to be Irish gets together. And Don Murphy's giving a whole bunch of money away, and that's a great way to celebrate. But if you do have to get out of town early. All right. Arron Johanson and I are talking about some of the things that may be kind of obvious, but I think that there probably are a lot of things, and I want to go back to the creation of this nonpartisan group that seems to be getting some work done. Maybe as an example of maybe how we ought to be interacting with each other all the time. What are some of the positive things that you've noticed in this group?
I think besides some of the budget reforms that we've already talked about is just the decreases in spending where they haven't been needed, and there's been an openness. There are many more Republican bills that pass and actually get hearings and pass than ever before. So, I think there are steps toward good government afoot.
Okay, I was asking just before the break if we could spend a little time on that which is important to us. And as you just explained, a $200 million drop in military spending. What would happen if we'd have a $500 million or $1 billion drop in visitor spending? And I know that there are any number of things around the world that can have an immediate knee-jerk effect on people's travel plans, as is this missing airliner. Who knows what ramifications in that part of the country? Right. People are thinking twice about getting on an airplane. Let's talk about that a little bit, because the big problem seems to be vagrancy and homelessness and some of these other issues. And I'm expecting, and so I think are most of voters expecting for the state and the counties to be able to work together on this. What do you see as some maybe steps in the right direction where it maybe will be us instead of them and us with regards to some of those issues?
I think everybody's trying to look at housing situations and shelter issues to be able to at least provide something for folks who want to sort of follow the rules and really are just down on their luck economically and need a place to sleep.
One thing, Aaron, is we see that as something that, like we've often explained, there's this world of difference between us and you guys when it comes to looking down the road. You're looking down the road 10, 20 years, whatever, and people want immediate clearance. In other words, they want housing, right, but they know that the housing is going to take, if you started it today, a year to build. In the meantime, there's somebody camping in front of my house. Yeah. So what they really want is, what about short term? And what about, quote, emergency legislation to deal with situations that impact our income?
Yeah, well, and you saw that during the Lingle administration. Yeah. Homelessness was declared a state emergency, and unfortunately, it hasn't necessarily gotten a whole lot better. But there are definitely different ways to attack the problem of homelessness, and you see more and more solutions that involve and entail mental health, substance abuse treatment, all these things, because that's part and parcel of the issue as well.
One issue that I was real concerned about this morning, and I've already received a bunch of email on it, and that is during the Lingle administration, there was some waivers or some exceptions made for people that were preparing food for the hungry. Well, the hungry, there's more of them now. And so this issue about health and kitchens and everything else comes to bear. What are your thoughts? Do you have any? I know that there are people, for instance, in your area that probably do provide home cooking for faith-based or other groups to feed homeless, and they're not going to be able to do that.
Yeah, in Mapunapuna, for instance, there is a soup kitchen that provides meals to the homeless, and it's typically drawing them from some areas of Kalihi and sort of near the freeways and whatnot.
But what I'm getting at is that people are saying, okay, this week our church is going to do chili and rice for homeless.
Mm-hmm.
So you got the big chili pots. One guy has these big military pots, and he makes 20 gallons of chili when he's asked to. That being said, those such things wouldn't be permissible anymore. And however, I guess maybe it's a piece of legislation that looks good, but enforcement would be difficult anyway.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what piece of legislation you're referring to. That might be more on a city level. I don't know that there's anything restricting, at least that I've seen at the State House, restricting treatment for...
Well, it was under the Lingle administration that Department of Health standards were lowered for certain groups that were cooking in homes. But now that there's this new deal out where if you do that, you're going to have specific freezers and 3 sinks instead of 2 and all of these other things. Well, most people don't have them in the kitchen, nor will they put them in.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Also, there's some concern that and this is probably at the city, so we won't spend much time on it, but that there are certain things, activities, parking and whatnot, you can't pull up to a park in some areas and bust out the tables and feed people because they're just saying that's not part and parcel. Is this something that gets bandied about a fair bit? I mean, are people understanding what really needs to be done?
There's a lot of discussion at the legislative sessions about homelessness, and I think the most difficult thing is just that it's such a multifaceted problem, which is why, and it requires a multifaceted solution, but it's often difficult to singularly address as just one issue. What
about the constituents that say, hey, look, they tell us, hey, things are great, unemployment is down, but yet so is the Council of Revenue. So, our unemployment numbers have dipped down a little bit. Are there some people that are trying to give you false senses of well-being in the legislative process? They need this because it works to work on this, and you can see how well we're doing. And in fact, it's just number pushing. They're not doing that well.
Yeah, I think it's all in the eye of the beholder. I don't think anybody's trying to mislead the legislature, but there are, everybody's got their cause and everybody's got their perceived need, and where the rubber sort of meets the road at the legislature is we have to adjudicate between all of those interests and be the arbiter to say this is worth taxpayer dollars and this isn't, or unfortunately this might be worth it, but we don't have those taxpayer dollars now, so it's going to have to wait.
Yeah, and by the way, here's a little help. The rules that we're talking about feeding homeless are part of a wide-ranging set of food safety regulations that were imposed on about 10,000 restaurants, lunch wagons, and the like. So the thing that just got approved last week is this. The report card, if you will, that's going to be on the windows of restaurants is being used to also go into people that are using off-site locations to cook food for homeless people. So it has, I guess, the pebble in the pond thing. What about what I asked you about in the very early part of the day today, and that was the importance of being timely and demonstrative with your feelings on things as we get closer and closer towards the end of the session?
Yeah, people definitely got to do it because 60 days is not a very long window, not a very big window, rather, for you to communicate with your legislature. And it makes a difference when people contact us to say, I really like this bill or I really don't, especially when it's your own senator or your own representative. But just hearing from the public in general is sometimes absent at the Capitol, which is why it makes it so much more outstanding when people do it.
Explain, if you will, what goes on when somebody writes a piece of legislation that makes sense. I've got this wonderful thing that we play, How a Bill Becomes a Law. It really is. It's comic, but it's really, really true.
Yeah.
And you've written, you have penned legislation, and you've been asked to co-sponsor legislation. When you write something, if it's clean, how soon is it before somebody says, hey, Arron, I really like that thing, and I want to help you out, and I'd love to support that. But I'm thinking that what I got in mind should be maybe done at the same time. Is that how things start to get sort of encumbered?
Sometimes. And, sometimes it begins, it happens any number of ways. Sometimes it's just because somebody is the advocate extraordinaire that just makes everybody believe in it. Sometimes it's because you find people who have similar ideas and they're interested in it and they're willing to support yours. Other times it's politics and people either like you or they don't like you, and they're willing to help you out. But
one thing that I really like, and that is the simultaneous thinking. Let's say that you have somebody that is diametrically opposed ideologically with the way you view politics. Mm-hmm. And yet you both come up with the same idea. We need to do this. And what a nice way to form a coalition or a partnership. Because I'm sure that there have been rank and file Democrats that you have a hard time with and vice versa, that when you both come up with a similar idea, it's, hey, I didn't realize how many things we had in common, let alone that we have not in common.
Well, that's what's missing sometimes in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
I mean, quite honestly, at the end of the day, I think everybody, whether it's state government here in Hawaii or the federal government, expects government to work for them and expects them to actually get some work done. And that's what I think is our highest calling, is to be able to work together in spite of all of our differences, just to get some good work done for the taxpayer.
You know, Arron, one of the things that I've often wrestled with is term limits. I've been doing this for a long time, and I think sometimes the fix is term limits eliminates 90% of politics because people are in there for a little short term. But then I realize the importance of passing on experience, and that there's some things and some people that shouldn't be limited by terms. But isn't that, I mean, a really tough area? Because, I mean, a lot of people saying, hey, I don't want a career politician. I want a businessman that comes in, lends his manao for a few years, and then gives it to somebody else.
Yeah. I think a compromise can be struck because I happen to believe in term limits, but I also think there's legitimacy to that argument of you lose institutional knowledge.
Yeah.
But you can make the term limits longer.
What about this? What about somebody that, say, terms out of the city council but continues in government service? There are a lot of people that will criticize somebody saying, well, they've been a politician for 30 years. They've never had a real job. That's not true, is it? Because even somebody that's a full-time politician, they got to get a few bucks together some other way, too.
Well, and government service is a real job.
Yeah.
It's one of the largest sectors, actually.
Oh, yeah, let's remember that. Whoa, got a little Irish music there. Hey, Arron, happy St. Patrick's Day. Thanks for seeing us today. Yeah. And by the way, Arron's looking good because you've been wearing a leg brace for several months, and it's gone. Must be like a new man.
Yeah, feels like it.
Yeah.